Hey everyone, and welcome to the Courage Conversation Show. I'm your host, Ashley Easter, and I am here with co-host Maureen Garcia. Hey Maureen, thanks so much for hosting me today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we always love this. And you were actually on one of our previous shows, I guess this probably about 2 weeks ago, and that was such an interesting conversation. And you actually found this amazing guest that we're going to have today. So I'm so glad that you're going to help with this interview because, so exciting, so exciting.
Yes, I'm very excited.
And for everybody tuning in, thank you all for watching. Would love, love, love for you to hit share on this because I know that you're going to enjoy the show, and I know that there's going to be people on your newsfeed that are going to want to see it as well. We're actually interviewing Emely Rumble, and I'm going to go ahead and read her bio to you. You're going to be blown away. This is going to be such a great conversation. So, Emely Rumble is an LCSW, a licensed clinical social worker in New York City who empowers clients to push past the challenges they face in order to thrive in life and relationships. And that's really what this show is about, like thriving. So already off to a good start. As a bilingual, bicultural clinician, Emely's style is interpersonal and culturally responsive. Emely is an advocate for neurodiversity, affirming mental health, and a believer in the social model of disability. She also is a biotherapist who incorporates the use of narrative techniques, storytelling, and literature into her work and with clients. Emely provides bibliotherapy, individual therapy, couples therapy, play therapy, and family therapy services in the state of New York. So we love having a good therapist on the show. Emely has such a unique perspective that we're going to get into. So you're definitely going to want to tune in. I think many of our hosts have differences in their brains. I'm dyslexic. And I know we've had different guests on the show who have different neurodiversities, but I'm not sure that we've actually focused on being able to talk through any of that. So I'm excited for that to come up in the conversation as well, because I know a lot of our audience is neurodiverse as well. So this is going to be so, so good. Hit that share button. If you're watching on YouTube, just copy the link above the URL, put it in your page because somebody else is going to want to hear this. All right, so we'll be back in just a minute after these messages.
Talk about it. I was told not to talk about it.
So I'm here to talk about it.
Because I can't stay quiet.
I was able to break my silence.
Because of those who refuse to stay quiet.
I am a businesswoman.
Activist.
Survivor.
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 Anxiousness can strike at any time, while driving a car, in the middle of the night, when giving a work presentation, or in a crowded place. Introducing Calmigo, a smart calming device that learns your personal breathing patterns and adapts to you for immediate relief in just 3 minutes. It quiets your senses through breathing regulation, multisensory stimulation, and calming scents. Don't stress another moment. Click the Learn More button and start using Calmigo today.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the show. We're here with Emely Rumble, and Maureen Garcia is also co-hosting today, which is always a pleasure. Thank you so much for being on the show, Emely.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, we are so excited. And Maureen, I know that you've been diving into Emely's work and you've come up with some really powerful questions. And so I'm just going to kind of pass the interview off to you. I might interject a little bit because I know this is just going to be a great conversation, but I'm so excited to have you lead this for us today.
Yeah, I'm super excited. This is very exciting. So, Emely, first I want to just kind of, I've got my questions here, so I'm going to go through them. All right. But first, a lot of people in our audience might not know or understand creative art therapies. So, among the many things mentioned in your bio, you are a bibliotherapist and you use narratives and story structures to help with your therapy. So, one of the things that you had said was the creative art therapies make therapy more accessible to all. Can you talk to us a little bit about what you mean by that?
Absolutely. So the creative arts therapies, or some therapists call it the eclectic therapies. It's a wide range, and it's sort of a
Mhm.
spectrum. Some therapists might specialize in one particular modality, and some of us use pull from each. And so that could
Mhm.
be the use of literature, drama, dance,
Mhm.
art, visual art, painting. And so what that really means is it's sort of like decolonizing therapy, right? Like these are all
Mhm.
things that many of us do as hobbies or just creatively in healing practice and mindfulness practice anyway. And
Mhm.
so it makes it more accessible because it's, for example, for me, I'm a bibliotherapist. Books
Yeah.
are free. You can go to the library, right? And that's
Mhm.
huge because there are people who may not think of it that way. Like, oh, I didn't
Right.
think of taking my child to the library and finding a book that's relevant to a current issue that we're experiencing in their development as
Mhm.
being therapeutic. But it absolutely is, because you're teaching your child new skills, you're giving them language through
Right.
books. And so
Yeah.
that's really what it's about, is helping to empower people on their healing journey by making sure that they can actually access healing practice, and also like sort of taking this idea of therapy and what can be helpful in our healing and in our self-discovery and evolution away
Mhm.
from these traditional ways of thinking that are even culturally inaccessible, right? Like when I speak with
Mhm.
people in my community, I'm from the Bronx, so the majority
Right.
of my clients are Black and Latinx clients. Like they, for the
Mhm.
most part, this idea of therapist as blank slate, traditional talk therapy isn't really, that's not going to interest my community. It's not going to help me build trust with my client. It's going to come
Right.
across as maybe me being a bit pretentious or
Right.
um, this like classic therapist idea. I feel like we need to dismantle that and help people to see how a lot of these things that we call therapeutic, especially when it comes to the expressive arts, you may already be doing. And there's a way that your therapist can work with you to strengthen coping skills that you already have.
Yes. Yeah. That's that whole thing is you just said so much and it's all of it's amazing. So, um yeah, in certain communities it's you don't go to therapy. If you go to therapy, you're perceived as weak and or crazy, or as opposed to it being something that is supportive that can help you learn to emotionally regulate or become self-aware. And so, like what you're doing, it removes all the intimidating, scary kind of stuff. I was recently on social media, and someone I know who is an abuse advocate, she was talking about having a therapy session with a therapist while they sat on paddle boards out like in water. And everybody was shocked, like, oh, you can do that? And so we all started discussing the benefits. And I was thinking, like, for someone who's neurodiverse and has difficulty with eye contact, that's, I mean,
Yes.
what a brilliant idea to be doing an activity together instead of just sitting facing each other in a way that just makes you feel
Yeah.
really vulnerable. you know, it's easier to be vulnerable when the entire circumstance and context that you're in is not adding to that vulnerability. So I love how you think outside the box when you come
Thank
at
you. I
therapy.
really appreciate that. And I love that idea to do therapy on paddle boards. I might have to look into that.
Right. So, and then you talk about different modalities and different ways of making it accessible to different people. And you had recently put up an Instagram kind of meme thing, and you had different yoga poses to read,
Mm.
and I had no idea that I was already doing some of like I all the time will lie with my legs straight up on a wall reading. And people are like, oh,
Yes.
how is that comfortable? And I'm like, it's just very comfortable. And I was like, oh, I'm
It's so
doing some of
comfortable.
this. But I love that. So, other than being an obvious lover of books and information and knowledge, which is all over your content, what attracted you specifically to bibliotherapy as opposed to the other types of creative art therapies?
Yeah, thank you for asking. So I started off my career as a school social worker for 12 years here in the Bronx, and it
Mm-hmm.
was really difficult to engage my clients.
Mm,
Youth in particular, you can't pull the wool over their eyes. They're very street
right.
smart, especially here in New York City, and kind of like
Yep.
have to feel you out. And so here I was, bright eyed, bushy tailed, ready to do some good school counseling. And my students didn't want to come into the counseling room. Just like you
Right.
mentioned earlier, there's a stigma. Many of my
Hmm.
students, just felt like it'd be social suicide for me to
Yeah.
be seen walking outside of the classroom, with Miss Emily to go to counseling. And so what I
Right.
started doing was pushing in to
Hmm.
classrooms and building rapport with my ELA teachers so that I could
Nice.
make their lessons socially and emotionally relevant.
Yeah, so students really had so much fun, not just playing out the different scenarios in the stories, but really talking about who's the villain in the story, who's the hero,
Yeah.
right? What are the motivations behind some of the villain's actions? And so we did a lot of role play. We would do a lot of um, anything that the kids really wanted to do. We would sometimes even have like mini performances in the classroom
Nice.
to really make the literature come alive. And the kids had so much fun. And they could also talk about some really harrowing themes, right? Through
Yes.
the
Yeah.
characters in the story. And I think Maureen made a good point earlier, which is to say, like, there's a way in which traditional therapy can be really overstimulating for some people. You have a therapist sort of staring at you in the face. How do you feel?
Yes.
Tell me your history. And especially kids, there's something about
Hmm.
that for teenagers, especially this generation of teenagers, that feels inauthentic. So to connect with
Yeah.
kids through storytelling in the classroom allowed me to build trust with students,
Yeah.
build rapport with them, also to show them like who I am and how I work. And it was exciting, that first student that let me know like, okay, I'm ready to go with you to your office today.
Yeah.
It's kind of like, oh, okay. And that really was my first introduction into the power of storytelling, but also as
Hmm.
like a vehicle for actual therapeutic work.
Wow.
Yeah. Hmm.
Something that comes to
Yeah.
my mind when I hear this is it's brilliant, but it it reminds me of like a lot of ancient practices. It I've
Hmm.
been learning a bit about different cultures and like shamanism and like healing, and just more of, I guess, more of a way that's more embodied, and there was also so many different cultures. They had like kind of oral history that was, passed on through like just telling stories, and it kind of reminds me a little bit of kind of getting back to um those practices that had been working. And there's, talk therapy can be good for some people, but it just sort of seems like it's taking ancient wisdom, but also pairing it with maybe some modern knowledge that we have now, and like making the best of both worlds. That's kind of what comes to my mind. Maybe tell me if I'm
Hmm.
completely off with that, but that's kind of what I hear when you're saying all that.
No, I
Hmm.
appreciate the comment because it reverberates so deeply with me. Like I tell people all the time, some people will say I'm not literate or I'm not like really well read. Is
Yeah.
this a good
Hmm.
study for me? And it's like we indigenous practices, like you even mentioned shamanism, right? Like oral storytelling is the heart of
Yeah.
storytelling. And even when we look at our families, like I'm sure you guys can think off the top of your head, there's stories that get told over and
Um,
over again in our
yep.
families. Oral
Hmm.
storytelling is absolutely the heart
Yeah.
of bibliotherapy. I think a lot of people
Hmm.
don't know the history of how bibliotherapy became professionalized, right? Like there's the International Federation of Biblio Poetry Therapy actually became a
Hmm.
nonprofit in the 80s, and they actually credential mental health therapists to become
Hmm.
bibliotherapists. So this like there's actually an institute that trains therapists in this modality. And it's also
Mm-hmm.
connected to a larger history that dates back to the Greco-Roman era,
Yeah.
dates back to King Ramses II, who had a library in his home that said House of Healing for the
Mm-hmm.
Soul. So therapy, it's always been. I just don't. I think somewhere along the way we forgot to continue to name it.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That's
Yeah.
really beautiful.
So, both of you, what you were just talking about makes me think of some of the work I do in the classroom. I teach at a Christian college, and I'm teaching writing skills and research skills. And often we're reading different types of literature. But one of the questions I often ask, because it's a Christian college and a lot of our students take Bible courses as core courses, I ask, like, why do you think that God created this book full of stories as opposed to, some kind of manual? The story is just poetry. And of course, there's rules and laws, but by far, there's more poetry in stories than anything else. And, they all come up with different kinds of answers as the semester goes on, but it's just stories are so relational, and they have something there's something very much identity creating and affirming about the type of stories we engage, which leads me to my next question. um, so, Emily, in your work, because you were saying that most of your clients are going to be Black or Latinx, and how do you um, what do you feel about representation? Characters within books, as well as the authors that are creating the literature now, because I see that it's slowly getting better, that publishers are recognizing that there's a market. But it's also discouraging that they had to, it took so long. But what do you think about that when people see themselves represented in books, whether it's their culture or their neurodivergentness? How does that
Absolutely.
impact readers? Hmm.
Yeah, I have a clinical answer for that, and then I have like a very personal, you know, parenting reflection on that. But I think in my
Hmm.
clinical work, it's powerful because I do a lot of inner child healing work using stories,
Hmm.
and I use a lot of children's literature with adults. And I get asked all the time, why
Hmm.
do I do that? So much of it is
Right.
because of the nostalgia of childhood. It's, trauma trauma's effect on the brain is such that sometimes we forget some of the
Yeah.
painful experience that we've had. The brain is really good at that, right? Like protecting us from the
Yeah.
things that hurt us, things that are difficult to remember. And I find that children's
Hmm.
literature is a way back to our younger self that
Yeah.
is it's safe. We can control the pace of that. It's
Right.
nostalgic. Many of us have memories as children of being read
Hmm.
aloud to, either by someone
Hmm.
at home, school. I'll never forget my first grade teacher, Miss Parkins. I can go
Hmm.
on for a whole hour about Miss Parkins, but using children's literature allows us to access those parts of ourselves. And I think to see ourselves reflected, especially those of us that, didn't have diverse books growing up, is very
Hmm.
healing. And in my
Yes.
parenting practice, I look at my daughter's bookshelf sometimes and I have so much pride because as a brown girl, she's reflected in every
Hmm.
single book. Did that intentionally. There's a grief in
Yep.
that for me though, because I didn't have that. But the beauty of
Absolutely.
it is even in that grief, there's repair because I can offer it to
Hmm.
my daughter. And in doing it
Yeah.
for her, I'm repurposing that part of myself. And so it's
That's
a
amazingly
beautiful
beautiful.
full
Hmm.
circle, yeah, full circle moment. But I tell people all the time, like I loved Alice in Wonderland. That was my favorite story as a kid. And I'll never forget the first time I saw Black Alice on a cover. It's the same story. It's just a little girl that looks like me and my daughter. And for me
Right.
to sit with her and be able to revisit that story, and for her to see herself reflected in Alice is just like a full circle moment that's so beautiful. It really does
Yes.
make a difference to see yourself.
Yeah, that's awesome that you have a place in the world. Yeah. Um, and I mean, it's nowhere near the degree of impact that you would have or your daughter would have as a brown girl. But as a daughter of Irish immigrants, I'm fair skinned. And most of what I engaged when I was a child reflected people who look like me, which is fine. Um, but I'm not aware, I wasn't aware until I became a teenager and was able to venture outside my neighborhood. which was full of Irish and Italian immigrants. And until I became an adult, I wasn't aware of how much I had missed learning experientially by engaging with characters that are different from me, or that are like from different cultures, but our cultures are similar. And My husband is Puerto Rican from Spanish Harlem, and we're always so fascinated whenever we find some new thing that is the same between Irish people and Puerto Rican people. And I mean, there's lots of differences, but there's so much that's the same that we were shocked culturally. Like
There is.
even with the food, like the blood sausage kind of thing. Like I grew up eating blood pudding, and but in his culture it's called macijo, and it's spicier, but it's the same thing, and it's like wow. But for like so for my grandchildren, because and for my niece who is Puerto Rican, I it, now there's so much more available. I can get them dolls that don't look like my grandchildren but do look like my like my niece. I can get them
Yeah.
different kinds of books. My students, I've had them read things like Before We Were Free, which is a young adult novel by Julia Alvarez, the woman who wrote In the Time of the Butterflies. Um, I've had them read Angie Thomas. I've made them watch the Angie Thomas, one of her movie, one of the books. But it just creates a space where it's just for someone like me and Ashley, and this is one of the reasons I started collaborating with Ashley. It decenters us, and we're so used to having been centered. Like my students, who that when they read a book, their default image of the main characters is a white man or a white woman, and it's like,
Yeah.
let's talk about that. Why is that? Like, what's been going on in the culture that's your default? Um, and it's I mean, this is one of the reasons why I find your work so amazing, because it's just so inclusive and so just valuing, honoring. um anyway, all right, so our audience includes a lot of abuse victims and survivors, and a lot of advocates or loved ones or abuse victims and survivors. So what kind of benefits can you see for survivors or victims and their loved ones using bibliotherapy, or even having an official bibliotherapy session?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's many benefits. It's definitely trauma sensitive work in that when you're reading a
Hmm.
book with a therapist, you can go at your own pace. You can really be mindful about a somatic approach. Trauma informed
Hmm.
practice is really important, and not every therapist specializes in working with trauma. We're sort of like
Right.
generally taught what trauma is and how it manifests and how
Yep.
it impacts
Hmm.
human and personality development, but to
Yep.
be a trauma informed therapist is a different sort of lens. And what I like about bibliotherapy is that, we're reading a book together. We can read it together or read it apart and come together. We can be mindful about our reading practice and really in our bodies. Like I just did
Right.
a series on literacy asking people to pay attention to the way that they read. So even what you just shared,
Hmm.
like there's visual readers, there's kinesthetic readers, there's auditory readers, and some of us are a mix
Hmm.
of a few of those or all
All
three.
of them.
So
Hmm.
even the question about when you're reading, do you visualize things in black and white or in color? That's not something many people think intentionally about.
Wow,
But if you think
that's true.
that, you might realize, wow, I always visualize white characters. Why is that? So those sorts of questions that are, you know, kind of difficult to talk about, bibliotherapy gives us multiple entry points to having conversations like that.
Nice.
And if we're speaking about a painful experience, a traumatic experience, especially an abusive one through the eyes of a character, that's safer
Hmm.
than
Yeah.
me having to sort of continue to express the details of my trauma. I actually recommend, especially when I work with, young therapists in the field or social work interns, I always like caution against that. Like unless you are really trauma informed and a seasoned therapist, you should not have clients, revisit the details of their trauma with you. That's not therapeutic and
Right.
it's not beneficial unless they themselves feel ready to share. And so that's
Hmm.
the main thing I would say is like the pacing that bibliotherapy allows and the multiple entry points to conversations and to healing practice. That's like
Hmm.
my favorite about being a bibliotherapist.
Wow.
Yeah, that's excellent. And I mean, you're talking about, that you talked about the multiple entry points and the going at their pace, and you also talk about safety, which is like the number one trauma informed principle. And also, you talk about agency, letting them choose to go at their own pace, or not forcing someone to engage with something that they're not choosing and aware of being ready to engage. Agency is such an important thing for survivors or for victims of abuse.
It is,
Um,
yeah. And I've had clients tell
mhm,
me, you know what, I love this book, but it's too raw. It's bringing up too much, or
absolutely.
and
Yeah.
I love it because then that tells me that you're paying even more attention to the signals that your body is giving you.
Yeah.
We cannot finish
Yeah.
a book. If anything, that's going to
Hmm.
give me more to work with.
Hmm.
Like few chapters and then it gets to be too heavy, then we stop reading, and then that's enough material right there for us to look at what emotion was elicited and why, and how we can use that to heal, how
Right.
we can use that to inform your healing journey. And I think even, narrative therapy is a similar approach, but it's different in
Right.
that narrative therapy was founded by David Epstein and Michael White, and it's a
Hmm.
way of looking at the multiple narratives in our lives and the meaning that we make out of those stories. And what I love
Right.
about narrative
Hmm.
therapy with survivors, I even had a client ask me on social media, she commented on a post and she said, what if the narrative, that sort of like the overarching narrative of your life is that of the abuser? And I told
Mm,
her immediately, I
absolutely.
responded, that is not your story. That is not your story.
Hmm.
That is someone who hurt you, who was harmful to you. That was someone who abused your vulnerability, who abused whatever the story is about the abuse
Yeah.
that you had to endure. That's not your story. You can rewrite that from an empowering perspective, and I'm here to help do that. And so
Yeah.
even thinking about like the stories that we tell ourselves, and really being intentional about letting go and shedding the shame of false narratives is so crucial to survivors of
Yes.
abuse. So that's
Hmm.
like, yeah, I guess that's
Hmm.
it in a nutshell.
That's no, that's so much like that you just said there with there's so much like so so one of the things that happens when people, especially children, but it happens to adults as well, when you're being groomed by an abuser, um uh, Anna Salter, who's an expert on sexual abusers, predators, serial killers, rapists, you name it, those people. She talks about how when someone is grooming you, that what happens is the abuser has a specific worldview. And when they groom someone, they're grooming them in two ways. One is the abuser has this view, and the potential victim, eventual victim, has the opposite. So it's kind of like he has the. I'm just going to use he in this case for the example. He has the I'm not responsible for the abuse. And then the victim picks up, I'm the one responsible for the abuse. So you have
Mm.
these opposites. But she also talks about these interconnecting kind of things where it like you lock into the abuser's beliefs about yourself. Um, I can't think of an example at the moment, but I will put them, I will link them, or I will type some up in, under in the discussion underneath this when it airs. But basically, the idea is that you internalize their worldview and their view of you as a person. And one of the things that Anna Salter and a number of other experts who treat both victims and abusers have talked about is this idea that when somebody has I forgot what you call it, but these false stories or these false ideas, false narratives about themselves, you can't just as a therapist or as a loved one say, oh, that's not true about you. I mean, we need to say that. We need to say it's not your fault. You are valuable. We love you, that kind of thing. But that's not the only thing that's going to help them change. That there needs to be stuff that is implied relationally, because the abuser doesn't have to tell you this is what I believe about you. They behave in a way that teaches you this is what's true of you. And one of the ways to come at that is through stories like this. If you present a story with a brown girl being valued and having agency, then the victim sees value and agency being applied to someone like themselves. And there's something in that, like you said, I forgot how you took, like you shed that false, it gets in there and takes on a life of its own. And you kind of, I think it was Jane Yolen, who's an author of children's books, young adult books. What you read becomes part of who you are. And that's what, whenever I see your content, I'm like, you are that principle from Jane Yolen come to life, that this is what you're doing with people. You're just giving them content that becomes part of who they are and just changes them in healing, just amazing ways.
Thank you. I love what you're saying about the relational aspect of that too, because so much of what keeps that cycle of trauma, keeps people stuck in that cycle of shame that ours to begin with, right, is not telling your story. So when I get a client to the point where they can share their story of abuse on their terms when they're ready, with the details or not, however they choose to tell it to me, I know that we've already hit the tip of the iceberg, because now I know that now I have an entry point where, as a therapist, I can let you know, one, thank you for trusting me with your story. But two, now we're going to write the story centering your voice, your truth, your world, and your identity, because your identity is not that you're a victim. This one aspect of your story is that you were victimized, and that wasn't your fault. Especially for people who had, who suffered abuse as children, this is so important, because how many safe places, spaces, and people do we have, especially when we're little, to say like, something is happening to me and I'm afraid. And how do you learn, like, even find the language, right? Like, we talk about storytelling, but language itself is really difficult to access, especially when you've been harmed. So that's such a key piece. Like, there is no healing through storytelling without relationship. And even like you said something as well about just when you see other people share their survival stories, it's empowering, because you now see that there's something on the other side. There is healing is possible, and this is one way that it could look. And one of the stories that I always talk about is Maya Angelou's I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, because many people are not aware that she's a survivor of childhood abuse. And in that book, which very hard to read certain parts of that book, but I think Maya Angelou is a perfect example of someone who used her pen to tell her truth. And so many women, have found healing through her words, because she was able to, like, she's literally she was a breathing example of a human, like, victory story about not letting abuse be that thing that defines who you are. Like, she was the person to say, like, yeah, this happened to me, but guess what I did with it, right? Like, I have the pen in my hand. I rewrote my own narrative, and I'm going to show you how it can be done. Like, this is why books are so important and storytelling matters, because many of us, when you're stuck in that shame cycle, you feel alone. You feel like you're the only one, or you're too afraid to say that you need help, or that you're confused, and there's not too many safe places and people, especially with the issues we have now in mental health care. Like, we see mental health care on two extremes. Either you're good enough to stay home and go to work and keep this, like, capitalistic machine churning and find yourself a therapist, or you're not well enough to function and you need to be hospitalized. There's no conversation about the middle piece, which is like, mental health looks different depending on many different circumstances and presentations. And to look at it only in these two extremes limits us. It limits us because then, that's a whole nother issue of, like, who gets access to what kinds of help and how do we identify that, right? So I'm so grateful for books and for people like Maya Angelou who write their stories,
Absolutely.
Mhm.
That's so
Yep.
powerful. And I also love Maya Angelou's story. Also, I think I heard about her through Oprah Winfrey, and I also really loved hearing Oprah Winfrey's story and just the amazing things that she overcame. And it made sense that, Maya was her mentor. They just, I don't know, just so beautiful. One thing I wanted to ask you about this is, like, I'm a person who has neurodiversity. I am dyslexic. And so sitting down and reading a book, it's not that I can't do it, and I do sometimes, but it is exhausting for me because it's just so much effort. And I know that there are other people who have different types of neurodiversities who listen to our show, and I'm wondering, is it still effective if you're hearing the story in an audio version, like listening to like an audible book? Are there ways that people can access these stories if sitting down and reading a book feels really daunting, but getting the information and hearing the story is something that excites them and might be something helpful in their healing journey?
Absolutely. Audiobooks are real books. I am a
Mhm.
big proponent. I actually think it's quite ableist when people say they're not. I really, I have my own reaction to
Yeah.
people who think that audiobooks are not. But absolutely, if you're an audio book reader, you're also probably an auditory reader. So you'd enjoy someone reading to you or reading aloud to yourself. And again, it's
Mhm.
going at your own pace. I think that's the beauty too of reading is that it's no rush. You don't there's clients that I've worked with for 3 years and we read one book and that's been the heart of our work together. So it's not about volume, it's more about the meaningfulness of and the therapeutic value of the literature that you read.
Mhm.
Yeah, thank
Yeah.
you for that.
Mhm.
Mm.
That's true. Depending on the type of neurodiversity you have, it can be difficult um, for different people to sit or to focus or you know. Um,
Yeah.
yeah. All right. So
I was
go
just
ahead.
going to say, lastly, before we move on from this, I had a client, I gave her some therapy homework to read on a
Mhm.
swing. We were talking about how she has no time to read, and I asked when she feels like she does, have a chance to slow down. And she said taking her kids to the park. So my assignment for
Mhm.
her was to read on a swing, and she loved
I
it.
love that.
She loved it. She got
Yeah.
so much joy out of that experience. She learned a lot about herself as a reader.
Wow,
Mhm.
that's so cool.
Yeah.
I listen to audiobooks while I'm like either driving or like doing something around the house. And I found that
Yeah.
sometimes actively doing something, the swing is a good example, or Maureen, you had brought up therapy on the paddle boats or whatever it was. Like,
Right. Paddle
I
boards. Yeah.
do find
Mhm.
it really valuable to be having something else to focus on because I can almost pay attention to the words better when I have like
Mhm.
I'm doing something.
Yeah. Mhm. Yeah. That's true. Um, is there anything else that you want to tell us before we ask you our last question? Anything that you think our audience would like to hear, or anything that's on your heart, or anything that's just really, that you're passionate about at the moment?
Well, I just want to thank you guys so much for sharing my passion of using literature to heal. And it's so
Hmm.
affirming when people tell me that my content speaks to them and that they're excited about
Hmm.
bibliotherapy. So thank
Yeah, I'm super excited. I'm super thankful for your work and for what you do. Um, so the last question we want to ask you is, what's the best piece of advice that you ever received?
you. Wow. That's a great question. The best piece of advice, right,
Hmm.
is to listen more and talk less. That's the best
Mm,
piece of advice I ever received. It really, there's so many reasons why that's the best piece of advice, but I think because I'm such like a verbal person and an advocate and I'm someone who especially when I'm impassioned I can really lead, you know, but I
Mhm.
found more value in centering other people's stories and using my strengths as someone who is an advocate to amplify those that can't access language as naturally. And it's
Mhm.
ironic because now I'm raising my son who is autistic and he is
Mhm.
nonverbal and he
Mhm.
uses a device to communicate. And there's this beautiful way that advice I got from my grandmother who passed when I was
Mhm.
14, and I think about her all the time because it's really deepened my parenting practice with my boy, and he's teaching me so much about all of the beautiful ways that we connect non-verbally. And I think it's
Mhm.
made me a better therapist.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Really beautiful.
Yeah.
Wow.
It's a different way of listening when
Yeah.
you're engaging someone nonverbal. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah,
That's so
that's amazing.
yeah,
Mhm.
and I do a lot of work with intuition. That's separate from the
Mhm.
nonprofit. I have a business where I work with people with intuition and just like you said, so many nonverbal things that we can pick up on. It is like a language unto its own, and you can't always hear that when you're not silent and you don't take that breath. So thank you for sharing that. And I know after
Mhm.
the conversation, people are going to want to learn more about your practice, about your work, and I'm going to go follow your social media. And I know everybody else is going to want to follow your social media. So tell us where people can find you. Do you have a website? Do you have Instagram? All the things. Tell us where.
Yeah, you can find my website at www.literapy, that's LITERP, literaPyNYC.com. And you can find me on social media, Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok with the same handle, Literapy NYC,
Mhm.
Literapy underscore NYC.
Yes. Mhm.
Oh, thank you so so much. And I really have loved this conversation. It makes me want to just go and jump into a book right after we finish up this. Yes, I have a list on my Audible deck, and so yeah, thank you so so much for your time. I know this is super useful, and Maureen, thank you as always for co-hosting. It's really great to
Mhm.
hear
Thank
your
you again.
insights and
Mhm.
all of your questions that you bring forward. So yeah,
Mhm.
everybody make sure you follow Emily's work. We'll make sure to link that below or above, depending on where you're seeing this video. And also follow us on social media. We have Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. You can find us in all of those different places. We stream every Thursday at 7 p.m. Eastern on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. So you can find us on any of those places 7 p.m. Eastern on Thursday nights. And then we have a lot of other things that we'd love to offer you. So if you head on over to our website, courage365.org, we have a variety of resources. So if you are in imminent danger, please, of course, reach out to the police or child protective services, whatever is applicable. But we also have a need help tab on our website, which has a lot of valuable resources, different hotlines, supportive blogs, and websites to help you find the support that you need. That's just going to our website, courage365.org, clicking the need help tab. We also, just as a gift for coming to our website, have this ebook called 5 Keys to Living a Life of Courage. It can help you take your next most courageous steps in your healing journey. If you enjoyed this episode, again, please give it a share so other people can enjoy it too and learn about this healing modality, because not everybody knows that bibliotherapy is accessible to them. It's available to them. It's something that is there, and reading a book is free for a lot of people, at least here in the US. You can rent books at the library, and there's just so many different options for that. And so please share this episode. Other things I want you to be aware of that we have available for you in our resources is number one, we have our text message list. These are encouraging, empowering text messages written by survivors from our community for survivors. And you can access these for free. All you have to do is get added to our list, and I'm going to show you how to do that. So grab your phone out if you're interested in being our text message list. We don't spam you. You're not getting messages from other survivors. It's just from us. And yes, we do often respond back to you, so it can be a great way to connect. Pull out your phone, and in the to place where you're going to put the number, there's a number I want you to copy down. All right. That is 917 917-809-7311. Okay, I'm going to say it again, 917-809-7311. And then in the message area, simply type the word courage, just courage, and then hit submit. You'll be automatically added to our text message list, and you will get text messages that are empowering, encouraging Monday through Friday. One other thing I want you to be aware of is we have online peer support groups for adult survivors called Courage Clubs. Those are the first Wednesday of every month. And if you haven't signed up to join those, you can do so for free. Also at our website, courage365.org/clubs. This is a great way to connect with other survivors and advocates and to really find a place to learn about different healing modalities, to learn about different topics related to healing in a supportive environment where you can feel free to share and talk about your own experiences or not, and just engage with the topic that we bring up that week and the healing tools. So go ahead and sign up for that if that would be a support for you. And I just want to thank you all for tuning in. This has been a great conversation. I love having these every week with you. And yeah, live with courage.